If you're coming from Pro Tools, then undoubtedly you are familiar with AudioSuite. Now, what is AudioSuite? Well, basically AudioSuite comes from a time when we were working with computers that didn't have the processing power that modern day computers have. So if you needed to do some EQ, instead of having a plugin running in real time, taking up processing power from your machine, you could actually apply that to an audio clip, and that could be rendered into the resulting file. Therefore, it would play back without any strain, as if though it was printed that way or recorded that way. Now, although this seems a little bit antiquated, I think there's still a place for this type of processing. So in Studio One, the answer to that is called event effects. Now, what are event effects? Okay, well, let's take a look at this bass track over here, and I'm just going to make a highlighted selection, maybe across these two bars over here, and I'm going to double click this to split this. So now, if we take a listen to this file, we're just listening to the bass. Let's say that I wanted to apply some processing from plugins just on that one particular file. So I'm going to open up the browser, and we're going to scroll to the Effects tab, and let's just work with some stock Presonus plugins for this case. Now, in a previous video, the one that we just did, I mentioned that you can basically drag and drop plugins directly to the track, or directly to the channel, or directly to the inserts, any part, and then it is going to apply that plugin in real time on this. So anything that's happening now, for example, if I was to filter this out, we'll filter out the top and bottom. Maybe we'll change the slope on this a little bit so we can hear a dramatic before and after. Okay, let's just copy this into the buffer here. I'm going to get rid of this. Now the idea here is that I just want to apply this directly onto this particular area. Let's zoom in a little bit as well. So the way that we do this, it's the same process where we're doing a drag and drop, but we are adding the alter option modifier, and this allows us to place a plugin directly on this event versus being on the entire track running in real time. Now I'm going to close this for a moment. Notice that we now have this little icon in the bottom left. Shows a little arrow. Let me just zoom in here. Shows a little arrow that says effects. The way that I'm doing that zoom is Shift or Alt Option, and we can basically highlight kind of like a range selection. But whereas Pro Tools Zoom would just do left to right, this will do left to right and top to bottom. And then holding the same two modifiers again and single clicking, you can step back through your zooming. That's just a little bonus tip there. So we have the ability to add this. Now, if we click this, we can see we have Pro EQ, and this will open up the plugin. Also, we have an option to use a modifier key. I believe it's Option or Alt F, and this will open up that same floating window. But the one thing to keep in mind here is that this is only on this particular event. Now, I could change the drag handles on this, and I can change the event bounds. So if I wanted it to be less or more, that's something that I can do as well. Also, in addition to that, if we click the info, the inspector here, right down at the bottom, and if you're not seeing this, just make sure that you have your views dragged up enough. You'll see over here that we have event effects, and we also have this option to render. So this is extremely useful. Now, if we click this drop-down arrow, we also see that we have other areas that we can add these effects. So I could use the plus arrow, and I could do something like this, for example. I would like to add a chorus. We'll just use the native chorus that's built into Studio One. Now we have a Pro EQ and a chorus. Maybe we'll switch this to two voices. So the idea here is that you can actually stack up multiple effects on top of each other. You could have an effects chain versus just having one plugin. We could stack multiple things together. So maybe what we'll do is we'll add one more plugin on this, and I think it'd probably be a good idea to, let's go with, I don't know, we'll do a room reverb. This we will do from the browser. Most of the time I'll do this from the browser. Alter Option, drag this over. So now we have Pro EQ, chorus, and room reverb. The other thing we can do is we can change the order of these if we want to. If I wanted to have the chorus first or the room reverb first, this is very much up to you in terms of how you want your effects chain to be handled. Okay, let's say that we're happy with this. And if I was to take a listen to this now, let's actually use my secondary tool. My editing tool is set to mute. And what this means is when I hold down Command, I can basically mute anything that I don't need. Locate selection to locate to the beginning. Let's listen. Okay, not something I would ever do, but let's say that it was. Let's say that we were really happy with that and this is what we wanted to do. We have this option over here to render. Now, what I'm going to do actually, just to kind of showcase something, is we know from previous videos, if we grab the bottom, this will move the edit point, but it'll make the two adjacent or butting up against each other, whereas this will allow us to move this and create some blank space. If we click the render option, notice that we have the ability to render this file, and now if we take a look down here, we no longer see the different plugins that were set up over here. And if we take a look over here, we still see effects, but we see this little gear icon. This is indicating that some type of processing, like for example, time stretching or anytime we've used event effects, has occurred. So now we have the benefits of being able to use an AudioSuite style workflow, but we also have the ability, kind of like all of the benefits of AudioSuite, in terms of offloading processing power, especially if you're working with some heavy-duty plugins, but none of the drawbacks, because at any given point in time, if I decided, you know what, I don't like the decay on that reverb, we can click the restore button. Now, when we click the restore button, then we have the ability, it basically just brings us back to where we were. And I could, for example, double-click this room reverb and say, okay, I want to adjust this length. I want it to be a lot shorter. So we'll adjust that to something like this. Maybe I need a little bit less on the mix. Now, also something to point out. We're working with a reverb, and with a reverb comes a tail. So notice in this particular section over here, we have the ability to adjust the decay time of the tail. So let's say I wanted a 2-second tail. I'm just going to type in 2s. We'll push return. Now if I render this, watch what happens now. Now we have a 2-second tail that's been added to this file. So instead of things being cut off abruptly, we have that tail. So I'm going to restore this again. Working with event effects, at first I was just looking for an AudioSuite equivalent in that it would open up in an external editor and it would be 100% kind of offline, and I'd have to render it and be able to work with it in that context. But once you kind of get used to it, especially when we talk about leaving them as a real-time process. So let's change this. For example, let's do something like, I'm going to crank the mix up, and let's also change the length. We'll go to something really long. So let's have a listen to see what this sounds like. And perhaps in this section, I don't want to do the whole area. Let's just do these last couple. You know what might be a better example than this is I'm going to remove the room reverb, and let's actually go to a delay. So we're going to go to analog delay, which is at the top over here. And let's drag and drop this on here. Now our dry wet is set to 30%. Let's just have a listen to see how this sounds. Okay, so maybe I want to make this ping pong, and I want to adjust the width. We'll go to the sum mode. So you can hear that that has an obvious decay where it carries on quite a bit. I'm going to, let's zoom into this. Again, my shift or option, I use this a lot just to zoom into a specific area that I want to work in. Let's drag this out to here, and let's actually drag this one back, and I'm going to unmute this. So now this one doesn't have any event effects on it, nothing. It's going to play as intended, as the original was. But this one, when we play it, keep in mind, it is going to basically carry through, and I'm going to just hold my shift modifier to relieve myself from the grid. So now what ends up happening is just for this one area over here, we're going to have delay, and we're also going to have a different EQ. So you can hear that when we have plugins such as delay, or anything that extends the tail, gives us a decay of some sort, this almost can become a substitution for automation, especially in these areas where you just want something to happen to one particular area. Because keep in mind, what would I have to do to achieve this if I didn't want to do this on the actual audio event itself? Well, I would have to add all these plugins to my chain. I'd have to be aware of my gain staging. In addition to that, I'd have to automate things and go through and dial in everything. Automation is great, but sometimes it can be a pain in the butt. So having the ability to just separate an area like this for this particular section, perhaps, and then say, okay, I want to have maybe just like some type of like Ampire or something, whatever you want to have, but just on that one particular area. This is a really cool way to work. And once you get used to it, I find that it's actually, it's quite good. And in a lot of cases, I will basically make a copy of my vocal track and things that I used to do on tracks, like for example, maybe delay throws, things that used to involve a lot of automation. It now becomes quite a simple thing where I might just decide to snip out this section or maybe just one particular area, separate this, and add event effects, add a delay or something to just that particular event. And the other thing to keep in mind is that if we need to make volume adjustments, well, we have our event gain. So we can increase or decrease this as needed. So it becomes a really cool way to work. It does take a little bit of getting used to though, but once you understand the concept, it's actually very simple. I'm going to actually deactivate all of these by clicking the top activate all or deactivate all. This will deactivate all of these particular inserts. And in this case, this Ampire instance, I'll remove this. Okay. Now, what about if you don't want to drag and drop and if you wanted to do this directly from the menus, if the browser was closed? Well, it's very easy to just, like I say, we'll do the same thing. We're going to separate this area. And all we have to do is click the event, and if the inspector is open, it's going to bring this area up for event effects. First, we need to enable this feature. And then we just search for whatever we want to use. So let's say I wanted to use a limiter of some sort on just this particular area. Now, this plugin is only affected on here, right? And then, of course, we know we can render and we can restore. And then we also know that we can adjust our tail in terms of how much decay we want to be rendered in. Now, one major difference I would say, if I had to pick out one thing that was a major difference, when you talk about Audiosuite, more specifically when you're talking about Audiosuite that's being used in an audio clip within Pro Tools, you have the ability to basically, in the preferences, set a handle so that you could adjust the event boundaries, and you could, for example, add a fade or something like that, and you could adjust where the fade happens or how long the fade happens for. This is not the case with event effects. When you work with event effects, and if I was to render this event effect, let's actually go back and do the same thing that we did again, but maybe we'll just use a Pro EQ or something like that. Where are we here? Let's use, actually, let's use a fat channel. I'm going to drag and drop this onto this particular area. Notice that at the moment, this is set to right over here. These are my event boundaries in terms of where I've made my cuts. If I render this, take a look at what happens over here. We have a file and a tiny fade out. And if I go over here, I can still make a fade if I want to, but I actually have to bring my event boundaries in a little bit so that we have enough information to be able to do this. So I'm going to resize this crossfade over here. And now I can only pull out to here because that's the edge. And if I go to the back half of this, same thing over here. I want to pull this fade in right to about here. I'll click X and this will basically resize this fade, and I can snap this to whatever I need it to be, and I can change the sizing of this fade. So for that reason, if your intention is to use event effects and then you want to have some control over editing, what I tend to do now as a force of habit is, let me restore this for a moment. If I know that I need to do further editing for anything, what I will tend to do is I will actually make the edit a little bit, let me get rid of this altogether. I will make the edit a little bit larger on either side. So for example, if I wanted to do this area, instead of making this, I would probably highlight out to a maximum area of somewhere over here. And then I would do my split, and then I would drag and drop this over, and then I would add any EQ or any adjustments that I want. Let's say I wanted to process this particular file. Then I can render this. My tail is set to 0 seconds. Now this is rendered. We have a bit of a gain change. At this point, I would quite simply just pull over my edits from the other side, and then I would just click the X on both sides, and then this will give me, basically, I have to kind of pre-build my handles into the audio before I render it. And then I have my handles. So if you do plan to do any further editing, that's something I would do, is I would overextend the event boundaries on the left and right edges so that you have a little bit of wiggle room for editing. It's just a habit I've gotten into. Now, I also want to take a moment to talk about ARA. My guess is that you've probably seen or heard ARA in action. You've probably seen some videos and thought, wow, that's a really great way of working. But we know the way that it works in when we talk about things like, for example, Melodyne. If you take a look at the antiquated approach, it was always about instantiating Melodyne as the first insert on a track, and then basically you would be recording the audio into the cache, and you'd want to make sure that you were doing that before you added your EQ, compression, or anything. And then when the DAW was playing back in the timeline, it would basically be playing back from the plugin cache versus on the actual audio file. Now, there's a drawback to that type of workflow, being that if you wanted to do any editing, like let's try to choose a file that's good. Maybe this one. What's this? Okay, there's our effects. Let me take my snapping off for a moment. Okay, let's take a look at working with this particular audio event. I'm going to use Melodyne, and there's a shortcut for that, or we can go to the audio and we can edit with Melodyne, the shortcut being Command M, which is mute in Pro Tools. So we ingest this file into Melodyne, and then anything that we do in terms of tuning or changing anything at all, for example, this now becomes something that's done completely in Melodyne. And we don't have to worry if we edited this file or we wanted to do anything, that's perfectly fine. So, okay, so let's say, for example, I'm going to change over my tool. Let's say that these two, I wanted to change them. This isn't going to sound good, but you'll get the point. Okay, let me undo that for a second. Okay, if I did any editing on this file, whether it was something like adjusting event gain, or if it was something like I wanted to make an actual edit to this, where I wanted to maybe snip this out altogether, or let's do something like this, and I wanted to do a fade in, notice that as I'm playing, so the benefit here with ARA type workflows is that they are loaded directly on the audio events themselves. Now, when you do this type of thing, it's obviously pre-fader. So the idea here is that we don't have to worry about rendering anything into a cache or anything like that, because we have direct access to the audio clips that are sitting within the pool. We have direct access to these particular clips. This is a really nice way to work, and it comes in handy, especially when you're talking about applications such as things like Vocaline or Melodyne. And it is based around ARA, or rather it is based around event effects, because the plugin itself is sitting directly on the event. But the difference here is that there is integration that is custom coded into the DAW. So we don't have to open up our browser, for example, and go to the effects tab and search for Melodyne and drag it over to every single event that we're working with. All we have to do is select these events and click Edit with Melodyne, or we also have other options. Vocaline is also directly integrated. So we have Edit with Vocaline, we have Edit with revoice-pro. So companies like SynchroArts and companies like, for example, Melodyne by Celemony, or Celemony, however you say that, I'm not sure. These are just working with Studio One, and the ARA workflows that you can use are really quite refreshing, especially when you're coming from an antiquated way of doing that. Now, I know that Pro Tools has some shortcuts to allow you to do something similar. Like you could use Melodyne and you could click the commit up to this point and it will give you something similar. But the difference here is, again, this is running in real time on my audio event. The audio event, whatever audio events you have them, this will be running completely in real time. And this has its benefits because you could basically be adjusting your tuning up to the last minute before you're printing a mix and finessing things. You could get kind of like a ballpark tuning going, continue to work, get started on a mix. And then of course, just like with the other examples, if you're happy with everything, and I don't think this is the case so much with modern day computers because they're quite powerful, but if you wanted to save some resources, you could say to yourself, okay, I want to render everything that I'm working with. And so I'm going to choose this one and I can render, and then I'll choose this one and then I can render it. And then basically we have all the advantages again of that workflow where if we need to, if you hear something down the line and you say, oh, I heard a little glitch, you have the ability to restore. So we could select each one of these, we could do a restore, we could select this one, we could do a restore. Also, let's say you had a bunch of events that were cut up and edited together. If we head over to our macro toolbar, in the, where is it here? In one of these options, maybe it's audio editing, event effects. Yeah, we have the option to render them all together. So if they're all selected and we do this and we click render event effects, it'll render them at the same time instead of having to click one event and click the render option and click the other and click the render option. So event effects and ARA integration, something definitely worth playing around. Really good for sound design, really good for things like delays, throws, or if you have a case where you're working with vocals and you find that one particular line of a vocal happens to be a little bit too thick, maybe you're comping and the artist has leaned in a little bit. Again, it's just a matter of separating this clip, finding the plugin that you want to use to correct that. Maybe it's just something like, maybe it's a plosive that you're working with and you just want to have this one section where you say, okay, well, I'm just going to kind of thin that out, but just for that one word, and you don't need to necessarily automate anything, then event effects is a great way to go. Okay, so this is it for this video. I'm not entirely sure about how I'm going to sequence all these videos together, so I don't know which one's coming up, but I will catch you in the next one. Cheers.